Step aside. This restaurant isn't for your type. Miriam Ashford's voice cut through the sun-drenched dining room like a blade, her diamond earrings catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling skylights as she tipped her wineglass sideways and let the deep red Bordeaux cascade down the front of Constance Diallo's cream blouse, slowly, deliberately, while her friends watched and laughed and the entire lunch crowd went silent. Constance Diallo stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, the wet fabric clinging to her chest, her reservation card still held between two fingers. The hostess looked away. Security began to move, and not one person in that room knew that the name above the kitchen door, Adama's, belonged to the quiet woman standing there soaked in wine, waiting for her son. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. It was 12 minutes past noon on a Tuesday in late October, and Manhattan was wearing its best light. The sun came straight down through the floor-to-ceiling skylights of Adama's restaurant and spread itself across every surface it could find: the white linen tablecloths, the crystal water glasses, the polished silverware resting at precise angles beside plates that had not yet been touched. The dining room had that particular hum that expensive rooms develop at midday. Soft laughter folded into the low register of ambient music, the clean percussion of cutlery, the murmur of people who were accustomed to being comfortable and had nothing to prove about it. The overhead light was generous and full, the kind that made everyone look slightly more important than they felt. Constance Diallo stood near the hostess stand in a cream blouse and navy slacks, a small brown leather purse hooked over her left forearm. She was 62 years old. She stood the way a woman stands when she has spent 34 years at the front of a classroom, upright, unhurried, occupying her space without apology and without performance. Her hair was silver at the temples and swept back neatly. Her shoes were sensible and polished. She held a reservation card between two fingers, the edges slightly worn from the careful way she had carried it in her purse since New Orleans. Not wanting to crease it, she was early. She was smiling. She was thinking about her son. Saoirse Mensah, the hostess, was a young woman in her mid-20s with copper-red hair pinned back beneath a black headband and a green blazer over a black top. She had just returned the confirmation of Constance Diallo's reservation with a professional smile and the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to make every guest feel expected. "Right this way in just a moment, Miss Diallo. Your table is being finished now." Constance Diallo had thanked her with a genuine warmth that Saoirse Mensah would remember later, when remembering things had become important. The entrance doors opened. It was the kind of entrance that displaced air. Miriam Ashford came through the door the way weather arrives, sudden, total, and indifferent to whoever was already standing in the space it intended to fill. She wore a white silk blouse and black wide-leg trousers, diamonds at her ears and her wrists. Her honey blonde hair set in the kind of effortless arrangement that costs a significant amount of effort. Behind her came Helena Dragici in an orange wrap top and dark tailored trousers, and two other women whose laughter was already running ahead of them into the room. They arrived in a cloud of fragrance and the particular noise of people who have never once considered whether they were being too loud. Miriam Ashford paused at the threshold and looked at the dining room the way a property owner looks at a building she is considering purchasing. Her eyes moved across the tables, assessed the other guests, cataloged the quality of the light, and then, briefly, sharply, landed on Constance Diallo. Something shifted in her expression. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the kind of adjustment that happens in a fraction of a second, in the space between perception and decision. Her chin lifted approximately 2 degrees. Her gaze went cool and flat and decided, the way a door closes. She moved to the hostess stand. She did not step around Constance Diallo. She stepped in front of her, the way someone steps in front of a display they have decided is not relevant to them. And she set one hand on the hostess stand as though placing a claim. Source. Her voice was pleasant, commanding, and constructed to make pleasantness and commandingness feel like the same quality. We need the corner booth, the one by the north skylight. We're celebrating Helena's birthday. Sorcia Mensah glanced at Constance Diallo, the briefest, most apologetic flicker of a glance, and then looked back at Miriam Ashford. Mrs. Ashford, good afternoon. I'm so sorry. That table is actually reserved for this afternoon's service. Miriam Ashford's smile did not change, but her eyes moved. They moved to Constance Diallo with the slow, appraising deliberateness of someone who has already drawn a conclusion and is now simply choosing how to express it. Reserved. She said the word the way someone repeats a phrase they find linguistically interesting but practically absurd. Then to Sorcia Mensah, but looking at Constance Diallo, I'm sure there are alternatives that would be more appropriate for everyone. She did not say, she does not belong here. She did not need to. The word appropriate sat in the air of that sunlit dining room and did its full work without any assistance. Constance Diallo looked at Miriam Ashford with the calm, steady attention of a woman who has spent decades watching what people reveal about themselves when they believe they are being subtle. She did not speak. She did not shift her weight. She simply held her reservation card between her two fingers and waited. Helena Dragici laughed softly at something one of the other women said. The sound was like a fork dropped on tile. Miriam Ashford turned back to Sorcia Mensah, and her right hand moved to her clutch bag. She withdrew something, a folded bill, thick enough to be significant, and she placed it on the hostess stand with her palm down over it, in that practiced, unhurried gesture that people perform when they have been performing it for long enough that it no longer feels like anything at all. Sorcia Mensah's hand moved forward. It covered the bill. Her eyes did not meet Constance Diallo's. Constance Diallo watched this happen. She watched the hand move, watched the exchange complete itself in under 3 seconds, and she looked at Sorcia Mensah the way a teacher looks at a student who has just made a choice she will have to live with, not with anger, not with accusation, with the patient, sorrowful clarity of someone who has seen this particular moment before and knows exactly what it costs. Sorcia Mensah did not look up. A server appeared at the table to Miriam Ashford's left and poured a glass of Bordeaux with the careful attention of someone who had been trained to treat wine like a living thing. He set the glass on the edge of the hostess stand for a brief moment while he confirmed the table arrangement. It was dark red and full, and the sunlight from the skylight above caught it and turned it briefly brilliant. Miriam Ashford picked up the glass. She turned to face Constance Diallo, and she looked, once quickly and deliberately, at Helena Dragici, making sure she was watching. And then she tipped the glass. The wine came in a wide, slow arc. It caught the midday light for exactly 1 second, and then it landed on Constance Diallo's cream blouse and spread, deep red against pale fabric, immediate and irreversible, down the front of her chest, across her collar, soaking through to the skin beneath. The dining room went silent, not gradually, immediately. The way sound stops when something has happened that everyone understands, on some level below language, is wrong. Constance Diallo did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not raise her hands or make a sound or change her expression in any way that could be described as a reaction to physical shock. She stood in the spilled wine, in the saturated fabric, in the complete stillness of a woman who has decided, long before this moment, what she is made of. She held the reservation card in her hand. She looked at Miriam Ashford. Her expression was something no one in the room could quite name. It was not hurt. It was not rage. It was not the particular theatrical calm of someone suppressing an emotion they would rather show. It was deeper than all of those things, and steadier, and the people who were watching her, and everyone in that dining room was watching her, felt the strange, unsettling sensation of looking at a woman who was not afraid, and could not be made afraid, and had known from the moment Miriam Ashford walked through the door exactly what kind of woman she was dealing with. Miriam Ashford set the empty glass down. She turned back to her friends. Helena Dragici's laugh came out brief and bright, and a second too late, like an echo of a sound that had not quite landed. From the far edge of the room, near the north wall, a woman at a corner table looked at her phone, then looked up, then looked at her phone again with the focused quiet of someone making a decision. Two men in dark blazers had separated themselves from the wall and were moving, unhurried but deliberate, toward the hostess stand, toward Constance Diallo. The dining room held its breath. The silverware was still. The glasses caught the overhead light and held it, and Constance Diallo stood in the middle of it all, soaked, dignified, reservation card still in her hand, and waited. Behind her, above the closed kitchen doors, the letters ran in clean brushed metal across the wall, catching the full force of the midday sun through the skylight above. Adama's. Nobody in that room knew what those letters meant to the woman standing beneath them. Nobody knew what she had carried to get here. Nobody knew what was behind those kitchen doors, or what it would mean when they opened. But they were about to find out. The wine was still warm against her skin. That was the detail Constance Diallo noticed first. Not the color spreading through the cream fabric of her blouse like a bruise finding its shape. Not the sound of the dining room going to the kind of silence that means everyone has stopped pretending they weren't watching. The wine was warm, and the warmth was almost familiar, and she thought, very briefly and with something close to dark amusement, that she had worn worse things home from worse days and still managed to make dinner. She did not move. She did not reach for a napkin. She did not look at Miriam Ashford. She looked at the reservation card in her hand. The card was cream-colored. Deliberately, she now understood, chosen to match her blouse because Marcus had always paid attention to details that other people called small, and he called the whole point. His handwriting was on the back. She had read those words so many times in the 3 weeks since the letter arrived that she could close her eyes and see every loop, every deliberate pressure of the pen. Table 1. Always yours. M. She closed her fingers around it gently, the way you hold something you do not intend to let go of. Around her, the room was recalibrating. She could hear it without looking, the soft scrape of a chair, a hushed exchange between two women at the nearest table, the particular quality of held breath that a crowd produces when it has witnessed something it knows was wrong and has not yet decided what to do about having witnessed it. She understood that sound. She had heard it in classrooms for 34 years, the silence that falls after one child has done something cruel to another, and the rest of the room waits to learn what cruelty costs. She had spent 34 years teaching that silence what to do next. The overhead light, through the skylight, fell clean and gold across the white linen tablecloths, catching the crystal, throwing small prisms against the far wall. It was a beautiful room. She had thought so the moment she stepped through the door, before everything else happened. The kind of beautiful that her son would have chosen deliberately, would have argued for in meetings, and defended in budgets, because Marcus Adama had understood since he was a small boy in their kitchen in New Orleans that the way a room feels when you walk into it is not an accident. It is a decision made by someone who cares enough to make it. She thought about that kitchen. She thought about the one at the back of Gittery's Diner on Freret Street, where she had worked the weekend double shift for 4 years. Friday dinner through Sunday close, wearing a green apron and sensible shoes, smelling of fryer oil on the train ride home, making sure Marcus had eaten and had his homework done before she left each Friday night, leaving a covered plate in the refrigerator with his name written on the foil in her teacher's handwriting. She had taken those shifts because the school salary alone wasn't going to cover everything. Not after Harold died. Not with an 11-year-old boy in the house who had just lost his father and was spending his grief in the kitchen, pulling down every pot, trying to teach himself to make things the way his father used to make them. Harold Diallo had been a preacher and a cook, which Constance had always considered two expressions of the same impulse: the need to feed people, to bring them to a table, to offer them something that went further than the surface of hunger. He died on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting in his favorite chair with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and the world he left behind was a woman of 41 and a boy of 11 in a yellow house on a quiet street, and not enough of anything except each other. She remembered the sound Marcus made in the kitchen the week after the funeral. Not crying. He had moved past crying quickly, the way some children do when the grief is too large for that particular release. He was cooking. He was making his father's cornbread from a recipe he had watched Harold make 50 times, and was now attempting alone for the first time, and he got it wrong twice and right on the third try. And she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her son feed himself on the only comfort he had left, and understood that something serious was happening in him, something she needed to protect. She used the diner money to buy him his first real kitchen knives when he was 14. She remembered the way he held the case, carefully, the way he had held breakable things since he was small, with a kind of reverence that some children are born with and others have to learn. He looked up at her and said, with absolute certainty, "I'm going to have a restaurant someday." And she said, "I know you are," because she did, because she had known it the way she knew the weather in her joints, the way she knew her students, not from evidence but from something quieter and more reliable than evidence. She thought about the phone call. He was 24. It was February, and the city outside her window was doing the thing it does in February when you are tired and the year ahead still looks long and gray. He called her from a payphone. He had lost his cell phone, he said, which she suspected meant it had been turned off for non-payment, and his voice had that particular flatness that meant he was holding something in. He'd been fired. Second kitchen job in New York. The chef said he had too many opinions for a line cook. He said he didn't know what to do. He said maybe he should come home. She had sat down at her kitchen table. She had looked at the wall where Harold's photograph hung, the one from their wedding, Harold grinning like a man who could not quite believe his luck. And she had said to her son, across 500 miles of telephone wire and February, "You were made for something that hasn't been built yet. Go build it." There had been a long silence. Then he said, "Okay, Mama," and she knew he meant it. That was 11 years ago. 3 weeks ago, a letter arrived at her house on Freret Street in a cream-colored envelope with a New York postmark. Inside was a first-class train ticket, a reservation card, and a single sheet of paper in Marcus's handwriting. The letter said that Adama's was turning 5 years old. It said that he had been thinking about her every day of those 5 years, the way you think about the ground under a building. Not always consciously, but as the thing that makes everything else possible. It said that he had one request. He wanted her to arrive as a regular guest. No announcement, no introduction. He wanted to see her walk through the door the way his other guests walked through the door, so that for once, just once, he could serve her the way he served the world. He said, "I have never been able to give you a table. Let me give you a table, Mama. Table 1, always yours." She had read it 4 times. Then she had called his cell phone and gotten voicemail, and she had said, "I'll be there, baby. I'll be there." So she was here, wearing her cream blouse, which she had pressed the morning she left New Orleans, and her navy slacks, and her small leather purse, standing in her son's restaurant with wine soaking through fabric she had chosen carefully, holding the card he had sent her, in a room that did not know any of this. She did not need them to know. Across the dining room, at a table set for one near the east windows, a woman in an olive green blazer over a white shirt was watching her with the particular stillness of someone whose professional training has taught them to observe without being observed. She had a phone on the table. The screen was on. The woman's eyes moved. From Constance Diallo to the wine-stained blouse to Miriam Ashford's table, where the laughter was already quieting into something more guarded. And then back to Constance Diallo again. And there was something in the set of her jaw that Constance recognized from her years of dealing with parents who arrived at her classroom door, already furious and entirely correct. The woman at the east table was not going to look away. She was deciding something. Constance Diallo did not need to know what the woman was deciding. She simply noted her, the way she noted most things, and filed it quietly away. Now she heard the approach. Not from Miriam Ashford's direction, from the other side of the room, near the corridor that led past the service station. Two sets of footsteps with authority in them, and one lighter set in front, moving with the careful speed of a man who is trying not to appear to be hurrying. She did not look up immediately. She let them come. Crispin Nakamura was a man in his mid-40s, in a well-fitted charcoal jacket over a white shirt, and he had the expression of someone who had assessed the situation from 10 feet away and was still working out the right register to pitch his voice in. He stopped in front of her. The two men behind him held their positions and were polite enough not to loom. He said, "Ma'am, I do apologize for the inconvenience. I wonder if perhaps you'd be more comfortable stepping outside with us, so we can sort this out more privately." His tone was careful. It was not unkind. It was the tone of a professional doing something he already understood was wrong, wrapping it in the language of hospitality, because that was the only language he had available to him in that moment. She let one beat of silence pass. She looked up at him, not with anger, not with grief, with the unhurried, absolute clarity of a woman who had spent 34 years making sure that the children in her care understood exactly where they stood. She held up the reservation card. "I have a reservation," she said. 3 words. Quiet as a closed door, solid as the floor beneath them both. And she waited. Antoine Ferreira had spent 15 years in professional kitchens. He had worked through fires, walk-in collapses, a gas leak in Lyon that evacuated an entire city block, and a James Beard dinner where the primary protein arrived 4 hours late and still somehow made it to the table on time. He had learned, in those 15 years, to read a kitchen the way a doctor reads a pulse. The rhythms, the silences, the specific pitch of controlled chaos that meant everything was fine, and the particular drop in frequency that meant it was not. He heard it at 12:47 in the afternoon, during the deepest peak of lunch service. The silence came through the service door like a change in air pressure. Not the silence of a room between courses, not the comfortable hush of diners absorbed in their meals. This was the silence of a room that had stopped on purpose. Antoine Ferreira set down the sauce ladle he was holding, wiped his hands on the green towel tucked into his apron strings, and pushed through the service door before his mind had fully articulated the reason. He stepped into the dining room and scanned the floor in the practiced way of someone who has managed emergencies in bright public spaces. The overhead skylights were pouring clean midday light across every table, every white linen cloth, every crystal glass, and all of it perfectly illuminated what had gone wrong. Near the hostess stand, 2 members of the security staff were moving with the measured, careful steps of people who believed they were handling a situation. Crispin Nakamura stood slightly ahead of them, his floor manager's composure intact, but his jaw set in a way Antoine Ferreira recognized as discomfort performing as authority. Antoine Ferreira followed the direction of everyone's attention. A woman stood at the center of it. She was wearing a cream blouse, or it had been cream once, perhaps 20 minutes ago. Now the fabric clung to her in a broad, wine-dark stain that spread from her collarbone downward in the unmistakable pattern of something poured deliberately, not spilled. She was holding a small card between 2 fingers. Her posture was so precisely upright, so utterly composed, that it took Antoine Ferreira a half-second longer than it should have to understand that she was the one being asked to leave and not the person who had done this to her. His gaze moved past her to the corner booth. 4 women. White silk. Diamonds. One of them, the one at the center, dark-haired, expensively constructed, was speaking quietly to the woman beside her, and the other woman was laughing in the small, satisfied way of someone watching something they had enjoyed reach its conclusion. Antoine Ferreira looked back at the woman by the hostess stand. He looked at her face, and then he stopped breathing for 1 full second, because he had seen that face every single day for 5 years. It hung in a simple frame on the wall of Marcus Adama's office, directly above the desk where Marcus reviewed reservations each morning before service. It was a photograph taken in New Orleans, outdoors, afternoon light, a woman in her 50s standing in front of a school building with the particular expression of someone who has given a great deal to the world and found it entirely worth giving. Marcus had never explained the photo to anyone. He had never needed to. The way he glanced at it when he was under pressure, the way he straightened slightly whenever he passed it, told everyone in that kitchen exactly what it meant. Antoine Ferreira turned around and went back through the service door at something very close to a run. The kitchen hit him with its full force. The moment he crossed the threshold, the overhead fluorescent lights, burning clean and total, over 40 feet of stainless steel, the controlled percussion of 8 cooks working in practiced synchronization, the smell of reduced stock and fresh herb and caramelized shallot layered into the warm air like something architectural. 6 burners were running on the left line. The pastry section at the far end was plating a dessert course with the focused silence of surgery. 3 tickets hung from the pass, and a 4th was printing. Marcus Adama stood at the center of all of it. He was at the pass, the long stainless steel counter where every finished plate came before it left the kitchen, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had trained his instincts for 20 years until they operated faster than thought. He was tall and broad-shouldered in his chef's whites, his name embroidered above the breast pocket in clean black thread. His orange-topped toque was pulled down level. He was holding a pair of plating tweezers over a dish, adjusting a single component with the concentration of a man who believes that what sits on that plate is a direct expression of everything he values. He called a ticket without looking up. Table 9, fire the halibut. Table 12, hold the second course. They're not ready. Yes, chef. Came back from 2 directions simultaneously. Antoine Ferreira crossed the kitchen floor. He came to stand at Marcus Adama's left side, just outside arm's reach, which was where you stood when you needed to speak to the chef at the pass during service without disrupting his hands or his focus. It was a position and a distance they had established over a decade of working together. It meant, this is important. Marcus Adama registered him there without looking. Talk. Antoine Ferreira said 4 words. Your mother is outside. The tweezers came to rest on the pass. It was a small motion, the setting down of a small tool. But in a kitchen running at full lunch service, where every movement from the chef at the pass carried information and instruction, it landed like a gavel. The 2 cooks nearest the pass glanced up. A 3rd one, halfway through a turn at the stove, slowed. The kitchen, which had been running at the precise controlled volume of a Michelin-starred service, went quiet in the way that kitchens go quiet when something has shifted above the level of food. Marcus Adama turned and looked at Antoine Ferreira. The look asked the question. It did not need words to ask it. It had the particular shape of a sun's sphere dressed in a professional's face, and Antoine Ferreira had known Marcus Adama long enough to read every version of it. Is she okay? Antoine Ferreira shook his head. Not the shake that means no. The shake that means you need to see this yourself, because there are things that exist outside the range of what can be adequately reported. Marcus Adama looked at him for 1 more second. Then he reached up, untied his apron from behind, folded it in a single practiced motion, and set it on the pass beside the tweezers. He straightened his chef's whites, both hands moving from the front placket downward, smoothing the fabric flat, the way a man straightens himself before walking into something that requires the full weight of who he is. He adjusted the name above his breast pocket without being aware he was doing it. He looked at Antoine Ferreira once more and said, quietly, "Hold service at the pass." "Yes, chef." He walked toward the kitchen door. In the dining room, Crispin Nakamura was saying, for the third time, that he simply wanted to resolve the situation in a way that was comfortable for everyone, and that perhaps stepping outside for a moment would allow them to review the reservation details in a calmer setting. He said this with the tone of a man who had been trained in conflict de-escalation and was deploying that training in the service of the wrong outcome. And some part of him knew it, because his eyes were not meeting Constance Diallo's eyes when he spoke. Constance Diallo was listening to him the way she had listened to school administrators for 34 years, when they were saying things that were technically polite and fundamentally not right. She had the reservation card still in her hand. The wine had dried to a faint stiffness along the lower edge of her blouse. She was perfectly still. She said, "I have a reservation." Crispin Nakamura said he understood that, and that was exactly why he wanted to step outside and verify. "I have a reservation," Constance Diallo said again. Not louder, not harder. Simply again, the way a fact is restated when it has not been heard. At table 4, Miriam Ashford had finished her glass of water and was examining the menu with the relaxed attention of a woman who believed the situation had been resolved in her favor. Helena Drakici was speaking quietly, and Miriam Ashford was listening with a slight smile, the smile of settled things. Dorothea Ellison, at her table near the east window, had not lowered her phone. She had been recording for 11 minutes. She was a journalist of 22 years, and she had never once in those 22 years wished harder that she were wrong about what she was watching. The security staff had moved to within 4 feet of Constance Diallo. In the kitchen, Marcus Adama was walking. The narrative closes the distance between these two things slowly, the way a lens pulls focus. The kitchen behind its closed door, the dining room in front of it, the 12 feet of corridor and threshold that separated a son from his mother. His footsteps were even. His shoulders were straight. His hands were at his sides, open. The hands of a man who has built something from the ground up with them and knows exactly what they are capable of producing. He reached the kitchen door. The door was solid brushed steel, the same steel as every surface in that kitchen, engraved at eye level with the single word that sat above it on both sides, Adama's. His right hand came up and pressed flat against the surface, and the door moved, pushed forward on its hinges, swinging outward into the light of the dining room. And the chapter ends precisely here, on the sensation of the door beginning to open and the light beginning to enter, and the moment between what has been and what is about to happen, stretching thin as held breath. The whole dining room on the other side of it, waiting without knowing yet what it is waiting for. The kitchen door swings open, and the room changes, not dramatically, not with noise or announcement. It changes the way the air in a room changes when someone enters who belongs to it completely. A subtle pressurization, a shift in gravity, a collective unconscious reorientation of every body in the space toward a single point. Chef Marcus Adama steps through the door and into the dining room of Adama's, and the overhead light from the wide skylights catches him in full. The chef's whites crisp and immaculate, his name embroidered in dark thread above the breast pocket, his broad shoulders carrying the particular stillness of a man who has learned to move through every room as though he built it, because in every room that matters to him, he did. He is 34 years old. He is 6 feet and 2 inches tall. His face has been on the cover of 3 culinary magazines in the past 18 months, and his hands, those precise, unhurried hands, have been described by Dorothea Ellison herself in a piece she wrote 2 years ago, as belonging to a man who understands that cooking is not performance but devotion. Several diners recognize him before he has taken 3 steps. A woman at table 7 leans toward her companion and whispers something, her eyes tracking Marcus Adama's path across the floor. The man at the bar, who had been staring at his phone, sets it face down on the counter and sits up straighter, the way people do when they sense they are about to witness something they will describe to others for years. 2 women near the window exchange a glance, not the excited glance of recognition for celebrity, but the sharper, more alert glance of people who understand that the story they have been watching has just entered its most consequential chapter. Dorothea Ellison, at her corner table, stops breathing. She has her phone angled low, still recording, and her journalist's instinct, the one that has carried her through 31 years of stories, through kitchens and courtrooms and disaster zones, tells her with absolute certainty that what is about to happen in this dining room is the reason she was seated at this particular table on this particular afternoon. She has covered Marcus Adama 3 times. She knows what his face looks like when he is in control. She has never seen his face look like what it looks like right now. Marcus Adama does not look at anyone in the room except his mother, not at the whispers, not at the security guards who are still positioned near the hostess stand with the sheepish posture of men who have just realized they are standing on the wrong side of something, not at Crispin Nakamura, his floor manager, who has gone the particular shade of still that belongs to people who are rapidly reconstructing the last 10 minutes from a different vantage point, not at Miriam Ashford, who sits at the corner booth with Helena Dragici, her champagne glass held slightly too tightly, her diamonds catching the skylight and throwing small cold sparks across the tablecloth. He looks only at the woman in the wine-soaked cream blouse standing near the hostess stand with a reservation card still held between 2 fingers. He crosses the dining room in long, unhurried strides. His footsteps make almost no sound on the floor his workers polish each morning before service. The route he takes is a straight line through the center of the room, past tables where people are holding their silverware without moving it, past flower arrangements that cost more than his mother made in a month of double shifts at that diner on Magazine Street, past everything he built and everything he owes, straight toward her. He stops in front of Constance Diallo. He is very close, close enough that she has to tilt her head slightly to look up at him, close enough that the wine on her blouse is no longer something reported to him by Antoine Ferreira, but something he can see himself, the deep burgundy of it, spread across the cream fabric, the precise cruelty of the stain, the way it has dried at the edges already, in the climate-controlled air of the dining room. He takes it in. He takes in the reservation card in her hand. He takes in her posture. Spine straight, shoulders back, the posture she held in the classroom for 34 years, the posture she taught herself after Harold died, because her children needed to see that a woman could carry grief and still stand upright. And then something happens to Marcus Adama's face that no amount of culinary achievement or media training or controlled professional authority has ever taught him to prevent. For 3 full seconds, 3 seconds that Dorothea Ellison will later describe in print as the most honest she has ever seen a public figure look in any room, in any context, anywhere, Chef Marcus Adama looks like an 11-year-old boy. The boy who stood at a graveside in New Orleans in a suit that was slightly too short at the wrists because they hadn't had time to buy a new one. The boy who came home to a kitchen that smelled like his father's recipes and found his mother at the stove with her back to him, shoulders working, not turning around for a full minute because she needed that minute to collect herself before she could face him. The boy who ate the meal she made and told her it was the best thing he had ever tasted and meant it with every cell in his body because food was the only language they both knew. For I love you and I am scared and we are going to be all right. 3 seconds. The dining room holds itself absolutely still. Then Marcus Adama collects himself. It happens the way controlled people collect themselves, not with a visible effort, not with a clearing of the throat or a stiffening of the jaw, but with a single slow breath drawn through the nose and released, and then the professional composure returning like a tide coming back in. He places one hand, gently, carefully, as though she is something that might break, though she never has and never will, on his mother's shoulder. He turns to face the room. When Marcus Adama speaks, his voice is not loud. It does not need to be. The dining room is so quiet that the ambient sound of the city outside the skylights is momentarily audible, the low register of Manhattan going about its afternoon, indifferent and enormous, while inside this restaurant, something irreversible is being said. "This is my mother," Marcus Adama says. "She has a reservation. She has always had a reservation." The silence that follows is not the silence that preceded the words. It is a different kind of silence, heavier, fuller, the kind that settles into a room after something true has been spoken aloud in a place where the truth was being actively avoided. It is the silence of people reckoning with the distance between what they watched happen and what they did about it, measured now against the 3 quiet sentences of a son who walked out of a kitchen to stand next to the person who made him. Crispin Nakamura has not moved. He is standing 3 feet from where he stopped when the kitchen doors opened, and the expression on his face belongs to a man who is performing a rapid and very uncomfortable moral inventory. The 2 security guards have stepped back from Constance Diallo. One of them has lowered his hands to his sides with the deflated posture of someone who wishes he could undo the last 4 minutes of his professional life. Sorsha Mensah is behind the hostess stand, and she has not touched anything, not the reservation book, not her pen, not the folded bill that is still in her apron pocket, pressing against her like something hot. She is looking at Marcus Adama's hand on his mother's shoulder, and her expression is the expression of someone watching a consequence take its shape. At the corner booth, Miriam Ashford's face has shifted. The amusement is gone. The proprietary ease with which she has occupied every room of her social life, the slight upward tilt of the chin, the lazy confidence of a woman who has never in 51 years of living been made to feel the full weight of her own behavior. All of it has drained from her expression in the time it took Marcus Adama to cross a dining room floor. What is there instead is something smaller and colder, the first crystalline touch of consequence. She looks at Marcus Adama's embroidered name above his breast pocket, and she looks at the woman in the wine-soaked blouse, and her mind is doing the mathematics that she should have done before she ever reached for that glass. Helena Dragici has stopped smiling. She is looking at her champagne with great focus, as though the bubbles in it require her complete attention. Marcus Adama does not look at either of them. Not yet. He looks back at his mother. This is the moment the dining room will remember longest. Not the words he said, not the authority with which he entered the room, but this. The way he looks at Constance Diallo, the way she looks back at him, the private language of it, transacted in full view of every person in the restaurant, intimate and complete, as though they are the only 2 people in the building. He looks at her blouse, the stain, the evidence of what was done to her in his restaurant, at his hostess stand, 50 feet from his kitchen. Constance Diallo shakes her head. It is a small motion, barely perceptible to anyone watching from more than a few feet away, but its meaning is total and unambiguous. "I'm fine. I have always been fine. I was fine before you walked out here, and I will be fine after." That is not the question. He looks at her eyes. She holds his gaze for 1 second, 2, and then she gives a single slow nod. It is the nod of a woman who has waited patiently for something she knew was coming. It is permission and instruction and faith delivered in a gesture smaller than a breath. It means, handle it. And Marcus Adama, the man who built this restaurant on the memory of a woman who worked double shifts so he could have good knives, the man who named every dish, every table, every principle of this kitchen After the education she gave him in a New Orleans house that smelled like cornbread and patience, turns. For the first time since he walked through those doors, he looks directly at Miriam Ashford's table. He begins to walk toward it. His steps are unhurried. His face is composed. There is no anger in his expression that anyone could point to, or name, or argue with. There is only clarity. Moving across a dining room floor, the distance between the kitchen door and table 4 was perhaps 40 feet. Marcus Adama covered it in 12 steps. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Every person in the dining room understood, in the animal instinct way that people understand things before language catches up, that what was about to happen at table 4 had already been decided the moment those kitchen doors swung open. The trajectory was fixed. The outcome was certain. The only remaining question was how much of herself Miriam Ashford would choose to preserve before it concluded. Marcus stopped at the edge of the table. Miriam Ashford looked up at him, and there it was, the thing her face could not hide, the thing that all her practiced social composure and her diamonds and her 40 years of believing that rooms belonged to her could not fully suppress in this particular moment. Recognition. And behind the recognition, arriving half a second later like a cold hand on the back of the neck, understanding. She knew who he was. She had known the moment the kitchen doors opened. She had seen his face on the cover of every major culinary magazine published in the last 3 years. She had, in fact, served those very magazines on the coffee table of her Sutton Place apartment as conversation pieces for her guests. She understood exactly what she had done. Helena Dragici was still holding her wine glass. The other 2 women at the table had gone perfectly still in the particular way of people who have decided that absolute stillness might render them invisible. Marcus Adama did not look at any of them yet. He looked only at Miriam Ashford, and his expression held no anger in it, which was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. His eyes were clear and steady and carrying something that was considerably worse than fury. They were carrying the full, unblinking weight of consequence. He said, "Mrs. Ashford," not a question, not a greeting, a simple placement of her name in the air between them, like the first item on a list being read aloud. Miriam Ashford's chin lifted slightly, a reflex. The social armor activating. "Chef Adama," she said, and her voice had the particular practiced smoothness of someone who has talked her way through uncomfortable situations before and believes she is about to do so again. "I'm sure there's been some confusion about—" "There hasn't," Marcus said. She closed her mouth. "I want to be very clear with you," he said, "because I think clarity is a courtesy, and I was raised to be courteous." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "Your reservation here is cancelled. Today's and permanently. Your name will be removed from our books." Miriam Ashford's eyes flickered. "Our reservation, your private dining membership," Marcus continued, and his voice did not shift in register by a single degree, "which your husband purchased at our founding gala 5 years ago, is revoked as of this moment. Our events coordinator will be reaching out to Mr. Ashford's office this afternoon with a formal notice and a prorated refund for the unused portion. We honor our financial commitments even when we are ending a relationship." The table had gone as quiet as the rest of the room. Helena Dragici had set down her wine glass somewhere in the last 30 seconds without appearing to notice she had done it. "And the New Year's Eve contract," Marcus said. "The annual catering arrangement that I believe your events team has already begun coordinating for December, that will not be renewed. I'll have my business manager send the formal notice before end of business today." Miriam Ashford stared at him. For 3 full seconds she said nothing, and in those 3 seconds the dining room of Adama's restaurant held its breath in a single unified silence. Overhead, the afternoon sunlight still poured clean and untroubled through the floor-to-ceiling skylights, lying gold across the white linen tablecloths, the crystal glasses, the half-eaten plates of food that no one was touching. The light did not care about what was happening beneath it. It simply illuminated everything with complete, democratic clarity. "You're making a significant mistake," Miriam Ashford said at last, and her voice had found a harder register now. The smoothness replaced by something more angular. "My husband's firm has relationships throughout this industry. Our social circle represents what your social circle represents," Marcus Adama said, still quietly, "is not something I'm thinking about right now." He glanced, very briefly, toward the hostess stand, toward his mother, who was still standing near it, still composed, his sous chef's jacket now around her shoulders, where Antoine Ferreira had placed it 60 seconds ago. Then he looked back at Miriam Ashford. "Right now I'm thinking about my mother, that's all." Helena Dragici made a sound that was the very beginning of an interjection. Marcus Adama turned to look at her. Just looked. His expression did not harden or soften. It simply transferred its full, steady attention to her, and he said, "You're welcome to stay and finish your lunch. Everything on this table was prepared with care, and I won't have the kitchen's work wasted." He paused. "But if you'd like to say something, I'd ask that you consider carefully what you just watched happen to my mother before you choose to say it." Helena Dragici closed her mouth. The two other women at the table appeared to be studying their plates with the focused intensity of graduate students preparing for an examination. From somewhere behind Marcus, from the direction of table 9, which seated a couple who had arrived early for their anniversary lunch and had witnessed every moment of what had occurred, there was a sound, small at first, deliberate, a single pair of hands beginning to clap, slowly, the way a person applauds at the end of something they know to be true. The woman at the table had her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and her husband joined her after one beat, and then the couple at table 12, and then the man sitting alone at the bar who had set down his glass and was nodding in the way of someone watching a long overdue correction finally arrive. It was not thunderous. It was not a standing ovation. It was the quiet, spreading sound of a room recovering its moral equilibrium, of people who had sat in silence during the worst of it, finding their voices now in the only way available to them after the fact. It was imperfect, and it was human, and it moved through the dining room like warmth returning to a cold space. Constance Diallo, near the hostess stand, did not look around at the applause. She looked at her son, and the expression on her face, patient, steady, unsurprised, holding 62 years of quiet certainty in it, was not triumph. It was something older than triumph, something that had been there long before today and would be there long after. At the hostess stand, Saoirse Mensah had not moved. She was standing with her hands flat on the surface of the stand, and the folded bill in her apron pocket felt in this moment exactly like what it was, a coal, hot and getting hotter. Her face was very pale and very still, and she was looking at Marcus Adama and then at Constance Diallo, and she was doing the mathematics of what she had agreed to 40 minutes ago and what it had cost the woman standing 3 feet from her. And the number she arrived at was not one she could make peace with, not today, not ever, if she was honest with herself. Dorothea Ellison, at table 6, had not lowered her phone. She was recording with the careful, unhurried steadiness of a journalist who understands that what she is capturing is not a scene, it is a document. She had been in this profession for 27 years. She had sat across from presidents and fraudsters and grieving families and brilliant, difficult artists. She had learned, across those 27 years, to recognize the moments that were larger than the room they happened in. This was one of those moments, and she held her phone level and let it record without commentary, because commentary would have been redundant. Miriam Ashford stood. She did it slowly, with the kind of deliberateness that is the final performance of a person who refuses to be seen as anything other than in control. She lifted her handbag from the back of her chair. She straightened the cuff of her white silk blouse. She looked at Marcus Adama with an expression that had moved entirely past the first cold touch of consequence he had registered on her face minutes earlier, and arrived now at something thinner and more brittle, the expression of someone who has played a hand they believed was unbeatable and is only just beginning to absorb the fact that it was not. She said, "You'll regret this." The words came out level and certain, and they were intended to carry the full accumulated weight of her social position, her husband's business reach, her 20-year history of being the person in every room who could make things difficult for people who crossed her. They were intended to land like a warning. They were intended to make Marcus Adama recalculate. Marcus Adama looked at her for a moment. Then he walked, unhurried, 12 steps in reverse, to the entrance of the restaurant, where the tall glass door stood beside the hostess stand. He pulled it open. The sound of midday Manhattan entered briefly. A cab, a distant siren, the ordinary alive noise of the city going about its business in the sunlight. He held the door and looked at Miriam Ashford across the length of his dining room with the complete, untroubled calm of a man standing on ground that was entirely his own. He said, "I very much doubt that." Miriam Ashford walked the length of the room. Helena Dragici and the other two women gathered themselves and followed. No one at any table watched them leave with anything approaching deference. The slow applause had faded, but the room's posture had not changed. It remained upright, clear-eyed, recovered. The gold afternoon light continued to pour through the skylights with its perfect indifference, illuminating white linen and crystal, and the name above the kitchen door, steady as it had always been. Adama's. Marcus Adama let the door close behind Miriam Ashford without sound. Then he turned back toward his mother. Miriam Ashford did not storm out. She didn't have it in her. She gathered her things the way people do after falling in public, quickly, with enormous effort applied to the performance of dignity. Helena Dragici followed without speaking. Her champagne glass sat half full on the white linen, a lipstick print on the rim. The other two women in their party rose in sequence, avoiding eye contact with the room, with each other, with whoever they'd been 20 minutes ago when they were laughing. They moved toward the entrance in a tight cluster. Their heels wanted to sound purposeful, and just sounded hurried. The door opened. The door closed. The dining room at Adama's, flooded with midday light, every crystal glass and white tablecloth burning clean and gold, took a long breath. Then the room moved, not all at once. A man at a corner table set down his fork. A woman near the bar exhaled and pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. A couple near the window began to applaud. Not loudly, not performatively, just two sets of hands coming together in a steady rhythm that said, "We saw it." Others joined. Not everyone. Enough. Constance Diallo stood at the edge of the hostess area in Marcus's chef jacket. Her son had draped it over her shoulders the moment he reached her, without ceremony, as if warming her was the first thing on the list. She took in the applause the same way she'd taken in everything else, and nodded once. The first person to approach her was a man in his 50s, forest green sweater, charcoal trousers, who introduced himself as Leonard, and then seemed to realize his name was beside the point. "I should have said something sooner. That was all." She looked at him. "You're saying it now." Something in Leonard's posture shifted. Others came in the same spirit. A young woman who'd been dining alone introduced herself as Priya, offered haltingly that she'd been trying to find the right moment to intervene, and now understood there had been several, and she'd missed all of them. An older gentleman extended his hand. "Welcome to Adama's properly this time." Constance shook it. Then there was the woman who said nothing. 75, maybe. Blue jacket over a pale gray blouse, white hair cropped close. She made her way over slowly, with the kind of certainty that comes from having lived long enough to know hesitation doesn't help. She took Constance's hand in both of hers and held it. No introduction, no apology, just held it, her eyes on Constance's. Then she released it, patted it once, and walked back to her table. Constance watched her go. Her chin lifted, her eyes were bright. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "Come see the kitchen." He led her through the swing doors, one hand resting lightly at her back. The kitchen opened around them in fluorescent light and stainless steel. A long room, every surface clean, the line moving the way a line moves when someone has spent years making it move that way. Constance stopped just inside the doors and looked at it. The brigade was there, 12 of them. They hadn't been asked to stop. They'd stopped on their own, turned from their stations with their aprons on and their hands at their sides. Antoine Ferreira stepped forward first. Broad-shouldered, late 30s, his whites immaculate despite the lunch service. He extended his hand and she took it. "Mrs. Diallo, it is genuinely one of the great honors of my life to meet you." He paused. "He talks about you." Constance Diallo looked at her son. Marcus was watching the floor, a small smile on his face, the kind of smile a person wears when they are caught being exactly who they are. "Every single day," Antoine Ferreira repeated, as if he wanted it documented. Constance Diallo laughed, a real laugh, warm and full, the kind that has no performance in it whatsoever, and the tension that had been residing in the kitchen since Antoine Ferreira's sprint through the swing doors 40 minutes ago dissolved completely. The brigade relaxed. Someone at the back exhaled loudly enough to draw a laugh from the station beside them. Marcus shook his head once in the manner of a man who accepts that his kitchen is, in this moment, completely beyond his authority, and finds that he does not mind at all. One of the younger cooks, a woman barely 20 with an orange bandana tied over her braids, pulled a stool from beneath one of the prep counters and set it near the pass without being asked. She looked at Constance Diallo and gestured toward it with a small, shy nod. Constance Diallo sat. Someone, Antoine, Marcus suspected, though no one admitted it, produced a cup of coffee. Constance Diallo wrapped both hands around it and watched the kitchen begin to move again, the service resuming around her with a grace that she understood instinctively. She had spent 34 years in a New Orleans classroom, watching young people learn what they were made of, and she recognized the particular quality of competence that has been taught by someone who believed in the people he was teaching. She could see her son in every deliberate motion, every quiet correction, every standard held without apology. She did not say any of this. She simply watched, and the watching was its own language. In the small office adjacent to the kitchen, Crispin Nakamura had closed the door quietly behind himself, and Saoirse Mensah was 24 years old and had been the hostess at Adama's for 11 months, and she had spent those 11 months being good at her job in the way that people are good at jobs they genuinely care about. She stood in front of Crispin Nakamura's desk now with the folded bill in her hand, held out toward him as though it had been burning since the moment Miriam Ashford placed it on the stand. Her eyes were red. She had not cried in front of the dining room. She was crying now. Crispin Nakamura took the bill. He set it on the desk without looking at it. "Tell me what happened," he said. "From the beginning." And Saoirse Mensah told him. She told him about Miriam Ashford's arrival and the immediate shift in the woman's attention when she saw Constance Diallo at the stand. She described the tone, the particular register of casual authority that implies consequence without stating it, the kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself as pressure until you're already under it. She told him about the folded bill appearing on the counter as naturally as a business card, the speed of the transaction, the way she had looked away from Constance Diallo's face because she could not bear to look at it directly. She told him that she had told herself it was just a table, just a seating arrangement, that the woman would understand that these things happened all the time in rooms like this. "They don't," Crispin Nakamura said. "Not unkindly, simply as a fact that needed to be established." "I know," Saoirse Mensah said. "I know that." Crispin Nakamura brought everything to Marcus Adama 20 minutes later. The bill, Sorcia Mensa's account, the timeline. He was not bringing it to excuse what had happened. He was bringing it because what had happened to Constance Diallo was now a documented sequence of events, and Marcus Adama needed to know the full shape of it. Marcus listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. He thanked Crispin Nakamura and sent him back to the floor. Dorothea Ellison had waited. She was still at her original table when Marcus returned to the dining room briefly, and she stood when she saw him. She was a woman in her mid-40s, wearing a deep green blazer over dark trousers, with the composed, attentive expression of someone who has spent a career watching things closely and understanding them accurately. She introduced herself, Dorothea Ellison, Senior Food and Culture Correspondent, and said that she had been recording from the moment Miriam Ashford inserted herself at the hostess stand, that she had footage of everything, and that she very much wanted to speak with both him and his mother before she made any decision about what to do with it. Marcus Adama looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Give us an hour." He went back through the kitchen doors. Constance Diallo was still on the stool. Someone had refilled her coffee. She was watching one of the younger line cooks execute a sauce reduction with a focus that suggested she was mentally grading the technique, and the line cook, sensing the scrutiny, was cooking with noticeably better posture than he had been 10 minutes ago. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at her, her back straight, her hands wrapped around the cup, the borrowed chef's jacket folded over her shoulders, her eyes bright and unhurried, and full of something he recognized as the deepest form of contentment available to a person who has spent their life building something worth loving. It was the happiest he had ever seen her look in New York. He made a decision, standing there, about the kind of dinner he was going to cook. The article went live at 6:47 in the morning, 2 days after the incident, on a Tuesday when Manhattan was still cold and gray-blue with early light. Dorothea Ellison had spent 48 hours writing and rewriting, not because she lacked material, she had more than enough, but because she understood, with the particular instinct of someone who had been a journalist for 22 years, that this story could go wrong in a dozen different directions if she let it. It could become a takedown piece. It could become a racial grievance headline. It could become celebrity chef drama, the kind of thing that fades by Thursday. She did not want any of those things. She wanted the true story. She took her time and wrote it true. The piece was titled, "What Adama's is Really Built On," and it ran in a major food and culture publication with a full-page photograph that Dorothea Ellison had taken herself 2 years earlier. Marcus Adama standing at his kitchen pass under the overhead fluorescent light, chef's whites immaculate, holding a single sprig of fresh thyme between 2 fingers and looking at it with an expression of absolute concentration. The subtitle beneath the title read, "A Story About a Restaurant, a Mother, and the Price of Dignity in a Room Full of People Who Said Nothing." It was not a hit piece. It was something harder to dismiss than a hit piece. It was careful, reported, and devastating in the way that only the truth, plainly told, can be devastating. Dorothea Ellison had structured the piece in 3 movements. The first was the history of Adama's, the founding philosophy, the Michelin stars, the founding gala where Damon Ashford had purchased the private dining membership that his wife had wielded like a weapon 2 days ago. The second movement was Constance Diallo, 34 years in a New Orleans public school, the double shifts at the diner, the kitchen knives, the phone call from New York, the handwritten letter with the train ticket. She had not interviewed Constance Diallo directly. She had gathered the shape of the woman from the people who loved her, and from the careful, deliberate way Constance Diallo had stood in that dining room with her reservation card and refused to be moved. The third movement was the incident itself, not reconstructed from memory, but documented. 4 separate guests had filmed portions of what happened. 2 of them had captured the wine. All of them had provided their footage to Dorothea Ellison without being asked twice. By 8:30 in the morning, The article had been shared 11,000 times. By noon, Miriam Ashford's name was trending. The footage was everywhere by then. Not just Dorothea Ellison's article, but social media, short-form video platforms, morning news segments that picked it up without context, and then scrambled to provide some. The clearest clip was 12 seconds long. It showed Miriam Ashford in her white silk blouse and diamonds, her gaze sliding sideways toward Helena Dragici to make sure her friend was watching, and then the deliberate, unhurried tip of the Bordeaux glass. It showed Constance Diallo standing perfectly still afterward, the dark stain spreading across her cream blouse, the reservation card still in her hand, her face composed in a way that 12 seconds of video could not fully explain, but that everyone who watched it felt in their chest. The comment sections were not gentle. Miriam Ashford's publicist, a young man named Trevor, who had never had a week like this one, issued a statement at 2:15 in the afternoon. It described the incident as a misunderstanding that had been blown significantly out of proportion, expressed that his client had deep respect for Chef Marcus Adama and his establishment, and noted that Monsieur Ashford was a committed philanthropist whose charitable work on behalf of several New York foundations spoke to her true character. The statement was 11 sentences long. It contained no apology. It contained no acknowledgement of Constance Diallo by name. Nobody believed a word of it. The publicist's statement was screenshot, captioned, and reshared faster than the original article. The charitable foundation Miriam Ashford chaired, a mid-size arts and culture organization that depended heavily on a small roster of very wealthy donors, began receiving calls by mid-afternoon. 3 board members issued a collective statement by end of business, saying they were aware of the circulating reports and were reviewing the situation carefully. One major donor, a woman whose name appeared on 2 of the foundation's gallery walls, withdrew her annual contribution by wire transfer before the business day closed. No announcement was made. No one needed to make one. Damon Ashford's real estate firm released its own statement the following morning. It was 4 sentences. It said that the firm did not condone behavior of the kind described in recent reports, that the views and actions of any individual were not representative of the firm or its employees, and that the firm remained committed to its community partners. Damon Ashford was not quoted in the statement. His name appeared only in the firm's letterhead. Anyone who knew how these things worked understood exactly what that meant. 3 other places dropped Miriam Ashford over the next 3 days. A private dining club on the Upper East Side, a members-only event space in Tribeca, the caterer who had done her annual parties for 6 years running. None of them said anything in public. They just stopped returning her assistant's calls. Miriam herself said nothing either. She wasn't at any of her usual lunch tables that week. Helena Dragici, who had been the loudest laugher in the dining room at Adama's, posted on her socials that she was horrified by what had happened and deeply regretted not stepping in. People reacted about how you'd expect them to react to someone who discovers her conscience the moment a camera finds her face. But that wasn't the story. The story was somewhere else. Marcus Adama gave Dorothea Ellison one quote. She had offered him more than that. She'd sat across from him in his office above the kitchen, her recorder on the desk between them, and asked him careful questions about his mother, about how the restaurant got started, about what it was like to build something and then watch someone use it as a stage for cruelty. He listened to each question. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the voice of someone who'd been chewing on something for years, "My mother taught me that excellence isn't a performance, it's a practice. Everything in this restaurant is an attempt to honor that." That was all he gave her on the record. Dorothea closed the piece with it. In the hours after the article went up, those 2 sentences traveled further than anything else in the story, further even than the 12-second wine clip, because they reached past the cruelty and toward what had been built in spite of it. Constance Diallo gave no interviews. She'd been asked for several by the time she was sitting in Marcus's kitchen On the morning the article came out, her hands around a mug of coffee, still in the borrowed chef's jacket she'd slept in. He hadn't let her take it off the night before, and she'd found she didn't want to. She read the article on the tablet he set in front of her. She took her time with it. When she was done, she put the tablet on the steel and looked out through the pass at the empty dining room, the linen set and waiting, the morning light coming clean through the skylights. "She wrote it right," she said. "She did," Marcus said. She didn't say anything else about it. Later that morning, she asked him for a sheet of notepaper and an envelope from the drawer in his office, and she sat at his desk and wrote in the looping cursive she'd used on classroom blackboards for 34 years. The note was for Dorothea Ellison. She thanked her for the care she had taken, told her the story had been told truthfully, and said that truthfulness was rarer than people admitted and worth more than they tended to think it was. She sealed the envelope and asked Marcus to have it hand-delivered. He did. Dorothea read it twice at her desk. When it got to her that afternoon, she put it in the drawer where she kept the things she wanted to keep. By the end of the day, the restaurant had taken more reservation requests than it had on any single day since opening. The reservations team worked through them without making a thing of it. The waiting list ran 6 weeks. Nothing in the kitchen changed. Lunch ran the next day at the usual temperature under the usual fluorescent lights on the usual stainless steel. Antoine Ferreira called the first ticket at 11:58, 2 minutes before service, the way he always did. And that night, Marcus closed the restaurant early. Not for a press event, not for a private hire. He called Crispin Nakamura in the afternoon and told him to send the front of house home once the dining room had been reset. And he told Antoine to take the brigade home once the kitchen was clean. And he told both of them he was grateful and would see them in the morning. The last one out was Antoine, who stopped in the doorway in his green jacket and orange cap and looked at Marcus for a second without saying anything. Then he nodded and went. The restaurant got quiet. Kitchen lights still on, full and bright. Above the dining room, the skylights were holding what was left of the day, gold going to amber. Marcus stood at the pass in his whites and started cooking. In the dining room, at the chef's table, under the best skylight, the linen was already set for 2, a candle, 2 water glasses, 2 sets of silverware polished until they were mirrors, and folded on the chair nearest the window, a clean cream blouse he'd quietly replaced. He was cooking for his mother. From memory, it was the only way he'd ever really learned how not closed the way it closes at midnight, after service, when the brigade has wiped down the pass and gone home. Marcus had locked it himself in the middle of the afternoon, from the inside. The book was blank, the phone was forwarded, the front windows were dark. From the sidewalk, Adama's just looked asleep. He'd sent everyone home by 3. No toast, no speech. He told Crispin and Antoine and the rest that the night was covered and they'd earned it. Antoine stopped at the kitchen door on his way out, looked at him a second longer than he had to, didn't ask, and left. Then Marcus started cooking. Every overhead was on, the fluorescents burning over the steel and the copper pans he'd picked out himself in Lyon on his first trip abroad. In the dining room, the skylight pulled the late light off the rooftops and turned it honey, and it fell across the one table he had set. White linen, 2 places, crystal, a short vase with 3 simple green stems. His mother got there at 5. Yellow blouse, dark slacks, that small leather purse, her hair pinned exactly the way she used to pin it Sunday mornings in the house on Tremay Street. She stood outside the glass and looked in at the lit table, and she put her palm flat against the door for a second before he came out and opened it. He was in his whites. He was always going to be in his whites for her. She came in and looked at him. He looked back. For a minute they didn't say anything, and it wasn't strange. It was just slow. Then she tilted her head the way she did when she was losing the fight with a smile, and he laughed. And it was the youngest he'd sounded in a long time. He walked her to the table. The first plate went down without him announcing it. Gulf shrimp, curled and sweet, in a butter and andouille cream that smelled like a Friday night in a narrow kitchen on Treme. Fogged windows, his mother in a diner uniform at the stove, with her shoes still on because she hadn't sat down yet. And he was hungry, and that's what came next. He'd been on the recipe 3 weeks. Not because he'd forgotten it. He wanted her to taste what he'd tasted as a boy, which wasn't really the shrimp. She took a bite and went quiet. Then she put the fork down and looked at him, and he caught himself watching her across the table, the same way he used to watch her from the kitchen doorway as a kid, waiting to find out. She reached over, brushed the back of his hand, picked the fork up again, and kept eating. The second course was the cornbread, small cast iron skillet. The top cracked gold, the edges dark at the rim the way his father had liked them. Harold had been a snob about cornbread. He'd kept the recipe on a folded piece of paper in the kitchen drawer, between the spatulas and a box of birthday candles. When Marcus was 11 and his father was gone, his mother took that paper out of the drawer and put it in her Bible, in the book of Ruth, and it lived there for 30 years. She'd handed it to him when he opened the restaurant. He'd never put it on the menu. He'd been saving it. Constance Diallo looked at the skillet and did not speak for a long moment. Marcus Adama watched her the way a man watches something he loves and is afraid of breaking at the same time. She reached out and broke a piece of the cornbread with her fingers, not with a knife, the way his father had always done it. And she brought it to her mouth and closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something in her face that was not sadness and was not grief, but was the particular expression of someone who has just been handed something they had assumed was lost. She said his father's name, just once, very quietly. Marcus Adama said, "I know." They ate the cornbread together in the gold light and talked about Reverend Harold Diallo, about the way he had laughed too loudly in church and apologized for it every single time, without ever actually laughing less loudly the next Sunday, about the garden he had kept behind the house with more ambition than skill, about the way he had called Marcus into the kitchen on Saturday mornings, not because the boy had shown any particular talent, but because he had wanted his son to know that feeding people was an act of love made practical. It was the first kitchen Marcus Adama had ever stood in. He had never forgotten it. The dessert came last. Creole pralines, arranged on a white plate, the sugar caramelized to the exact amber his mother had pulled from the stove every Sunday morning before church. The pecans toasted in the oven the night before, the way she had shown him when he was 6 years old and barely tall enough to reach the counter on his toes. The pralines were not elegant. They were not plated with the precision of the other courses. They were stacked the way she had always stacked them, warm and imperfect, and completely right. Constance Diallo looked at the plate and pressed her lips together, and then shook her head slowly, with the expression of a woman who has been entirely outmaneuvered by someone she loves. She picked up a praline and bit into it, and the sound the sugar made was the sound of Sunday morning in New Orleans, and the light through the kitchen window, and the smell of church clothes being pressed in the next room. Marcus Adama watched her eat it and felt, somewhere behind his sternum, the specific piece of a man who has done the thing he was made to do in front of the person who made him. When the plates were cleared, Marcus Adama reached beneath the table and placed a small frame in front of his mother. She looked down at it. It was the reservation card. The original one, the card she had held through everything 2 days ago. The card still in her hand when the kitchen doors had swung open. The card she had not let go of through the wine and the security guards and the cold sweep of a stranger's cruelty. He had retrieved it before it could be lost among the afternoon's debris, and had taken it to a framer the same evening. The front was printed with the restaurant's name and the date and her name, Mrs. Constance Diallo. The back, in his handwriting, read what it had always read: Table 1, always yours, M. She looked at it for a long time. Outside the skylight above them, the last of the afternoon light was burning down into deep gold and then into something closer to amber, and the city was doing what the city always did, indifferent and vast and ongoing. But in here the light stayed warm. In here the light knew where to settle. Constance Diallo looked at the framed card and then looked at her son. She did not say anything. She placed her hand over the frame on the white linen tablecloth and left it there, warm and still and certain. And behind the closed kitchen doors, the name above them, Adama's, held steady in the light. A kept promise, a whole life, a table that had always been hers. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.